Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer, director, EP, living in LA.
And I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachael, Raver, and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So one of the things that we're here to do is to find some hidden heroes. It's called the Hero Maker podcast. And people ask me, well, what does that mean? Why is it called that? And I have just been saying tragedy breeds heroes. And a lot of them you just don't see. You don't know who that person is who's going the extra mile to get something achieved for a family or a victim or a case.
I love the premise of sussing out the heroes from the different waypoints of the story that we have to tell, because particularly as I learn more from you and from our guests, there's so many. To me, this is a really nice part of what we're doing here, not just to honor our friends and tell their story, but to, along the way, shine a spotlight on people who, through their either heroic or everyday actions, made a super outsized impact on a community or on an individual or on a procedure, on a way of life.
Just interesting that the different places you find heroes and how some of this trauma can actually forge like a whole new life or lifestyle for some people.
Well, we should probably talk a little bit about Rachael and Warren for our listeners, just so that they get a little bit of a sense of who they were to us. Obviously, to state the obvious, I think we've said it, they were both student athletes at George Washington University at the same time that we were. Warren was on the baseball team and Rachael was on the soccer team. She was on the soccer team that I was on, and they were college sweethearts. So what else do we remember?
So when we were at George Washington in December of 1988, I can actually pull up the exact date. I think it was the 5th or the 6th.
The 6th, I think.
Yeah. They were found on the 6th.
That's the day everything came tumbling down.
It started, I think, on Sunday night. I would describe it as some anxiety and questions and concern and stuff. But by Monday, folks were really on edge, really, really on edge. And it had become clear that both of them were unaccounted for.
I know that some of the things that went through people's hearts and heads were like, oh, maybe, hopefully, maybe they eloped. Because they had been together for a little while. I know Rachael was about to go into law school. Mm-hmm. The last time anybody saw them was the night before. It was Saturday night. There were a lot of people who were out at Mr. Day's, which is a bar that we frequented. Mm-hmm. I actually was not someone who went out very much.
Right.
This didn't help.
It was not uncommon at all for groups of us to go out there. And we didn't always leave together. That's not, you sort of all get there at different days.
But they left early.
They left early, this is like, will never cease to be a matter of tremendous irony for me. They left early and sober by comparison to many of our friends because they were being responsible and responsive to an event that his parents had going at their church. And they were not ashamed to say that's why they were leaving. And this made it different because a lot of kids in that age group would never say, hey, look, we're leaving this great time. We're leaving our friends at a bar, places hopping, and we're leaving because we got to get up early to go to church with my boyfriend's parents. Like, that was noteworthy in and of itself. And so they left and nobody thought anything of it until, like I said, Sunday evening is the first time I recall people starting to become very worried. And by Monday, it had dialed up tremendously.
Yeah. And we're going to talk to Rachael's sister, Deirdre Raver, today. Maybe they came down Tuesday. They had to come down to DC. They were driving down to kind of help with the search.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, Sunday, Monday, it's really only like 48 hours.
Yes.
They say moving and getting information in those first 48 hours is critical. Is that something that you can speak to as a police officer? I don't know how much of your time you've been an investigator, but I know that there was a large part of your career where you were an investigator.
Sure. So the first 48, obviously, it's the name of a TV show. So folks cling on to that a little bit. And there is never a hard line in the sand, whether it's 48 or 42 or 58 hours. But it is very true that the more information and leads you can gather in the early phase of an investigation, the more likely it is that you're going to find threads that you can pull. And that once you start getting these threads that you can pull, those turn into additional leads. We know that people move. People who aren't aware that maybe they have relevant information quickly cannot be found if you don't identify them early in the process of an investigation. So really locking in who was in the vicinity, who might have seen something. This incident happened long before the time of cameras in every business and cameras on every street pole. But nowadays we try to get to those sources quickly so that they don't automatically overwrite themselves. You know what I'm saying? So that time is on your side in the first 48 to 72 hours. And after that, memories get disturbed or rewritten, particularly in today's era of mass consumption of social media and 24/7 news cycle. People's true memories get altered by what they've heard or been told. And I would say the first 48 to 72 hours are key in any investigation where you need eyewitness information.
Yeah, and this would be one of those, but there were no eyewitnesses. No one saw them. So I don't think it was ever clarified exactly how they were either abducted or carjacked or what point it happened that they intersected with the person who ultimately took their lives. But there was some kind of abduction, and they ended up on the side of the road in Virginia across the state line. Their bodies were found Tuesday.
Yeah, that was the moment that the proverbial other shoe dropped and they had been found in the worst possible outcome.
Yeah, how much did we know? Because now I know a lot about the condition in which their bodies were found.
We knew what we saw on the evening news, and I believe it was the 6 o'clock news. That's what we knew in the beginning. We saw bodies zipped into body bags being taken out of a field, a grassy area, one of them anyway, high, tall grass. And then it was in the days after, even maybe a week after, that we started to get more information. Probably within 24 hours to 48 hours, we learned that Rachael had been sexually assaulted. And we also learned that Warren had been assassinated, basically made to kneel and shot in the back of the head.
I definitely want to correct you. He wasn't shot in the back of the head, but he was shot in the back at a downward angle.
Interesting. That's an interesting fact, because if you're sure that you don't want to waste lead and really get the job done, shooting someone in the back is not the most efficient way to kill them.
I'm just adding this because we're right here. One of the facts is that Rachael was also shot in a similar way, and it was testified by forensic experts and everything that she was not dead when she was raped. So she was shot and then she was raped. She was also dragged. And these are conditions that we found out later in more detail than anyone would necessarily want.
If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York, between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info@theheromakerpodcast.com.
Today we have this amazing guest who has lit me up around the story of my friends, Jen's friends, who were murdered when we were in college. This was the first person who I got to connect with, who just went through everything from day one until today. She has lived with this experience. I'm going to introduce you to Deirdre Raver. And Jen, I think you've met Deirdre before, but
I have.
It's probably been a minute since you've seen her. And Deirdre was someone who went through this experience, but in a way that she was so energized and activated by her, and she'll put it in her own words for you, but this is what I was left with. She was so motivated by a lack of answers and a compulsion to find answers and to actually get justice for her sister that she did amazing things. She became a victims advocate. She went and got a degree in criminal justice. She lobbied to change laws and help change laws in the state of New York, where she lives and was raised. She also traveled and spoke about the case. And I'll let her tell you more about this. But I'm just so honored that Dede's here to talk to us today. Hi, Dede.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. It's great to see you.
Hi, Dede. I do have to echo what Andy just said about us all being inspired by the energy, by the tragedy that you turned into momentum, and you went on such a positive trajectory where so many other people might not have. But I remember that because we were still young. We were youngins when this all happened. I still remember your response to this as being incredibly motivating, and like you were a tremendous role model for how one might choose to respond to tragedy. And actually just seeing you is making me feel a little sad.
Wow. Well, it was quite a journey that we all took. And I have to say, I was very lucky that I met other people going through a similar journey. Had I not met them, I would have never even thought of doing some of the things that I did. But I met other families that had close relatives that were taken from them through a homicide. And they spent all their energy and time trying to help the police solve the case by bringing attention to the case, creating the flyer. The flyer is so important. It brings in leads to the police. And the police rely upon leads, and leads give everybody hope. So I was very, very lucky that I met people that shared their experiences with me. Also, the National Victim Center gave me a lot of advice. They were an organization that started by a brother and sister who had their mother murdered, and the murderer got away with it. So they started this nonprofit organization. So the victim rights movement was very, very big when Rachael was murdered. And it was really just starting out. It was just getting its legs. So there was a lot of issues involving victims and allowing victims to have more input into the criminal justice system and be part of the system and be recognized, as people. And even today, when I look at these cases, you see that the families sometimes are not taken into account for. You look at the biggest stories on the news and the families are still sometimes the last ones to find out stuff. And I think one of the frustrating things for me and everyone who loved Rachael and knew Rachael is our case was unsolved. And that's true of more than half of the cases that we have in America. They just are unsolved. No matter how many resources you put into a case, sometimes you just don't get the murderer like you do on TV. So that I think the hardest thing for me is not having answers. Closure. I wanted closure. And, we were very lucky. We had police that knew what they were doing, that were working very hard on the case. We had the cream of the crop. We had a great police department, and it was still very, very staggering and overwhelming to look at picking a needle out of a haystack.
Mm-hmm.
We had to pick a needle out of a haystack. And thank God for science, because if it weren't for science, we probably would have never found Rachael's killer, or at least known who he was. So that was a big deal, because you can't grieve when someone's murdered in your family. So the only thing you really can do is somehow get involved with something and feel like you're doing something. Otherwise, the feelings of helplessness are just overwhelming.
So you have two other siblings, right?
Yes.
And I know your mom was very impacted by the case. I mean, obviously the whole family was, but you were also it seemed like you were almost partnered with your mother and carrying the weight of her concern in a lot of what you were doing. Can you talk about, because I'm just assuming that there was a variation of the way that it impacted various members of your family. And I'm really looking at the early days before you even knew about the link to Tina Jefferson's murder. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like before, and then what it was like once you got the news that there was a link to another homicide?
Well, in the beginning, I know my mother and father were obviously very overwhelmed. It was very hard for them. But what often would happen is my brother and I would be the ones to call the police. And my mother would call the police too, but generally it would be my brother and I. And one of the reasons is that you would see a case that's very similar and it would haunt you. You really couldn't think about anything until you made sure the police knew about the case. And again, it is picking a needle out of a haystack. So if you see a similar case, there are things in place in the criminal justice system to alert police departments if there's something similar, but it's a big country, you know? We would see a similar case or something we'd read about in the paper. And so my mother would ask me to call. And my brother was very involved, but his involvement was very private. People grieve different ways and they handle it different ways. So he would privately call on his own. And I would never know he was doing it. Of course, my brother was in a different situation. He was on active duty with the Marines. And then he became very, very involved with a new wife and started a family. So things were quite different for him. But he was very private, but he became very involved as well. But my mother would see something and it would haunt her. For example, we saw stuff on Unsolved Mysteries sometimes. And of course, 2 other cases were on Unsolved Mysteries around the time that ours was on. And it was the same guy who did it, the same killer. And we didn't know each other. We were separated by state and we just didn't know each other. So.
But at the time that you saw it, you didn't know that there was a connection.
No, not at all. I mean, I would see cases and I'd say, this is the one. And, it was really sad because I know the detectives really appreciated any time we called and it keeps the case alive for them. And I would write down what I wanted to ask them. And sometimes I wouldn't get those questions answered because they were very good at diverting because they had the integrity of the case in mind. Later on, when we would go to court, we understood why they did what they did. But there were some answers they had a little more information. They wouldn't share it. Because anything that they share, you'd tell one person in your family, do not tell anyone. And they'd say, okay. And they'd tell one other person, don't tell anyone. And that's how you get leaks. And, a great example is that is a leak that just happened with those poor families in Texas. Those families were supposed to sit down and look at a tape. And next thing you know, the media had it. And that's how it happens. You have to be very secretive to some extent. And that's very hard for families because, we just want a few answers.
Can I come back to this thing about the episode of Unsolved Mysteries? Because I remember being interviewed for that episode. I have no idea if I ever appeared in it or not. But are you saying that when it aired, there were other cases highlighted in the same episode and now we know that they were the same killer?
Not the same episode, different times. My mother, would watch
there is
it.
a really good story here. Tell the story about your mom and watching the Tina Jefferson profile.
Well, she saw the Tina Jefferson profile and she called. She was very concerned about that. But it was not one of those cases where she called me on the phone and said, you have to call the detectives. She just felt like it might be related. And I do remember one time, that was on Unsolved Mysteries, but my mother saw it and it really, really hit her hard. Maybe because it was in Virginia and it was a young girl.
But wasn't she also murdered on Rachel's birthday?
Yes, Tina Jefferson was murdered on Rachel's birthday.
Right.
So that also kind of set off my mom as well. My mom saw these things and it really, really haunted her. But, hate to say it, but I saw a lot of cases that I was absolutely sure this is the one. And I would call the detectives. And when I didn't hear back, I knew that it didn't pan out. So I'd wait a nice amount of time and then I would call them and they'd say, I'm sorry, it just wasn't. But if you see that again, let us know. Always let us know. But I remember there was a couple, there was one that really bothered me where they had the victims on their knees. And later on, I found out it's possible that my sister was kneeling and so was her boyfriend before they were murdered. And so I wasn't that crazy. And I also wasn't that crazy when I was handing out flyers and I was on a train and one of the stations was Jamaica, Queens. And we had found Rachel's car in Jamaica, Queens. Now, at the time, we hadn't found the car. And I wanted to get off the train and go down the stairs and just hand out a couple flyers to a couple policemen. And I saw a police car. And I thought, don't do it. Yeah, it's just too weird. Like you're going to go up to these police, hey, my sister's on a solved case. Go out with your friends. I was visiting a friend in Long Island. Go visit your friend and just let this go. You've done enough this week. Unbeknownst to me, that car was not that far away from that station. I mean, it was ripped and shredded, but still 2 young cops getting a flyer like that and then driving by and seeing the car sitting there. It was right there. So it can't help to... That just the networking. And the other thing is, and it kind of haunts me a little bit, is we had a Hispanic interpretation of the flyer. We had it in Spanish. And I wanted to hand those out more. And I wanted to hand them out to a Spanish TV station and then a very well-known newspaper that is in Spanish. And at the last minute, I said, just let it go. You've got the interpretations out there. But that there was somebody living right there who might have picked up that newspaper and seen. And who knows whether they would have said something or not. They may have said nothing at all. Looking back, it could have put them in danger. If we had come close to him, we could have been put in danger because he definitely called me on the phone. And there's so many nuts that call you, you can't be sure.
I want to hear about this, but I think we need to go back and get a little bit of structure for like the timeline. If you could quickly run through the first time you heard, hey, my sister's missing. And then those couple days, I know you got in the car to come down to DC. Then what happened? And then please take us from there to how you got to Queens, why you're in Queens, and then tell us about getting a call from the killer. Can you just give us that little timeline?
So the horrible news, first of all, Rachael was missing. So we were hoping it wasn't the worst, but we had a really bad feeling about it because she didn't report to work and her boyfriend, no one knew where her boyfriend was. So that's all I knew. And I rushed home when I worked on Wall Street. I rushed home on the train up to where my parents lived. And by the time I got there, one of the neighbors was there to pick me up. I called her on the phone. She said, where are you? I said, the train station. She said, I'll be right there. So right there, that was a showstopper because I couldn't get through and my neighbor's picking me up. So right away, I knew there was so that was when my neighbor picked me up. She pulled over the car and she just told me they found the bodies in the woods. And I lost it. I was screaming and it was really horrible. There's nothing like that. And I remember going home and seeing a lot of relatives and a lot of neighbors that I grew up with. And we're just surrounded by all these people. And it was considered normal to have like all these people in our house that normally wouldn't be in our house with us all the time. And I remember a police chief that I knew who I had called because all we knew is we needed to find the car. That car, the car was stolen. So he said, if we find the stolen car, we'll find out who killed Rachael.
And it was your sister's car, right?
Right. My father had given her the car. And it was one of those situations where we weren't sure she put the right license plates on yet. We were in between license plates. So I'm trying to explain this to a police chief, and he thought that I said that the license plate was missing. And if we found the license plate, we could find the killer. And he's trying to tell me to get medicated and to get some medication to calm down. And I actually was being very rational. It's just the way that I spoke, he misunderstood obviously misunderstood me. I remember he said, it's a big country. You may not find this. And it was very frustrating for us because we would drive around, we would see cars we thought looked like my sister's, and of course it wasn't. And there were other relatives who would see a car that looked like Rachel's and they would follow it. And it wasn't her, of course. But we're looking for a car in Virginia, but we're in New York. We're living in New York at the time. So we don't know if the car is in New York. Not that we know the killer or anything like that, but we're looking everywhere. So we called a lot of people and we expected to find it. And guess what happens? Well, the car was driven by the killer to Queens, right down the street from a police station. And in New York City, a lot of cars are dumped. They're dumped all the time. So when a car is dumped, it gets ticketed. But at that time, a ticket doesn't get registered into the same database as when you're pulling somebody over. So if you're pulling somebody over, like the killer, if he got pulled over, he would have gotten caught because they would have seen this license plate being flagged. But when you ticket a parked car, they're not going to run a police report on a parked car or an abandoned car. They just don't. There's just too many of them. That was very hard for me to take because I was like, what do you mean? So I ended up calling a police detective I knew in New York City. Basically what happened was my mother got a summons in the mail. She got a letter in the mail from New York City, a summons to pay for tickets on Rachel's car. That's how we found out where Rachel's car was. So that really kind of, my mother went nuts.
And that was like 6 weeks after she was killed, right?
I want to say more like 8 weeks.
Okay.
So 6 long weeks or 8 long weeks, right?
So you're spending 8 long weeks looking for a car.
Right.
It was a brown Toyota Corolla, right?
Right, brown Toyota Corolla.
Yeah, I remember this.
Remember this, right? And it was sitting right there. So, and in fact, I was right down the street from that car, when I was handing out the flyers. So I think it was more than 6 weeks. It was a little bit longer. And what happens to a car when it just sits there in New York City is it gets stripped. They start taking stuff off of it, and somebody set it on fire. And so, of course, all these things happen. But it takes a while. Like when they found the car, I thought for sure that a lot would happen. And nothing happened. So I called a friend of mine who's a detective in New York City, and I said, can you please help? I knew him from the National Guard. And he said, do yourself a favor. Go down to one police plaza, go down to where the tickets are, and ask for a copy of the ticket. Just say, I want a copy of the ticket. They won't even question it. Get a copy of the ticket, look at the ticket, and see what precinct is on it. And call that precinct up on the phone and ask to speak to the homicide detectives and give them the phone number of the Virginia police. So that's what I did. And it was a very interesting conversation, I must say. The closest place I could find that I felt safe was one police plaza. I couldn't read, it was very sloppy. And I asked a policeman, can you help me read this? He said, sure, that's the 103rd precinct. Thank you. And I went this is when we had payphones. Remember the payphones? I lived on those payphones, right? And I put a quarter in the payphone and I called the 103rd precinct. And when I started talking to them, they said, okay, who are you? We have a lot of cases here. I explained to him, this is my sister who was murdered. Her car is right there. We have a ticket, blah, blah. And he's like, slow down. Where are you now? What's your name? You could tell there was a group of people around him. And it was a detective named Junior. They called him Junior. Really nice guy. And they kept saying to me, if you come down to the precinct, call us first. Don't just come down here. Don't come down here. Call first. Okay. And I remember them saying that. And if I did call them, they would put a pot of coffee on because they didn't want me wandering around there, which actually was good advice, was not to be wandering around there because he was still in New York for a certain period of time.
And someone recommended to you from the victim center that's one way to...
A mother. Her son was murdered by a couple strangers. They robbed him and they murdered him in cold blood right on the street.
And this was just somebody you met through like a support network?
In a support group.
Okay, got it.
And these victim support groups don't just give emotional support. They give information to victims. Like, this is how it works.
Jennifer, I'm wondering if you have any questions for Dede.
This whole thing is fascinating to hear some of these behind the scenes pieces that I didn't know. I don't know if you saw me, but I winced, at least on the inside, when Dede said that while she was trying to relay some information to a police chief that she knew, that the response was to get medicated so that she could get her act together. And I absolutely winced when I heard that, because again, in those first few days, there's two key jobs for the police. The first one is on the operational side, to get as much information as you can to try and get facts and try and move the case along. Now, obviously, a police chief who's not involved in the investigation, who lives up in upstate New York or where you guys were from, he's not investigating the crime. So in that case, the other police responsibility is to do the best job you can as a liaison to the family, to be a conduit of information, to try and help connect them to resources, to help bring order to complete chaos, to begin, although it doesn't feel like it, but to most importantly, don't say the wrong things, which I would categorize what you just shared with me as being the wrong thing, but try to start saying some of the right things so that the healing a seed can be planted. There's no healing that's going to happen in the first moments after sudden unexpected death, but you can minimize the trauma to a family by the way you interact with them. And so I was saddened to hear that was the response you got from one of my predecessors. But the other interesting note that I'm waiting to hear more about was how you know that the killer called you, but I know we're getting there on that. And the other, I guess, question I had for you is, how did you get connected to the victim support groups? Because it sounds like in the pre-internet days, being connected to that type of group would be immensely helpful for navigating your way through the aftermath of this tragedy.
So the way that we got connected back then is there was a victim assistance program in Virginia, and they contacted we had the National Victim Center. So one of the things that the National Victim Center did is they set up an immediate database of all these places so that if you're a victim advocate in Virginia, you know where to find the victim advocates in New York. And the ones for homicide survivors were superb. And by the way, I didn't mean to be so hard on that police chief. He meant well, but he panicked and he only heard that I was looking for license plates. He didn't hear that I was looking for a car, and he panicked. So here's a guy who I would normally turn to, whereas, you know, the detective just calmly said, make sure you get this information and pass it on to your detective right away. And that is really important for families to do. Don't take anything in your own hands and try to solve it, because you'll end up with a mistrial, or you'll make a mistake. You know what I mean? As much as we think we know what we're doing. But this network was phenomenal. So I knew there was one in New York City, and it was just a matter of getting in touch with them. So I remember that I didn't go back to work, and I didn't think I could ever go back to work. And it had been almost a week, and I thought I was going to take off 3 or 4 weeks at least and not go back to work. It was just too overwhelming. And so I had heard about victim services. I had their phone number. I had their location. So I literally walked in there. I was a walk-in. And this woman didn't realize that I was a survivor and started talking to me. And then she said, oh my goodness, please come inside. And that's where it started for me. And next thing I know, I was going back to work. I called my job because this woman told me, if you can't make it back at work, you just don't go back. But you got to try. Yeah. And if you need to leave the room, you leave the room and cry and go back to work. See how it works out for you. And if it doesn't work out, then you take it from there. And surprisingly, I was able to do it. And other people I know never go back because nobody is there to push them and let them know that they can try.
Yeah.
It's not the same. You know, things are not the same. But, you know, to show up to work and stuff, to sit around and think about an unsolved case all day versus being at work and then intermittently think about the unsolved case is a lot easier to do.
Yeah.
So that made a huge difference for me because I stayed with that job for, I don't know, 13 years or something. And I wanted to move ahead to other jobs, but I never did. I stayed at that job, but at least I had a job. And I had...
Can I ask you a question, Dede, about the role? How important is the role of the employer in helping a survivor heal in the wake of a traumatic event?
It makes a huge difference. And I had a boss at the time that was a little bit uncomfortable with what happened. And she suggested that, you know, if I needed to take, that I couldn't work with the media and things like that, that it might impact my job. And when I had one of the interviews with Fox News, because we were calling the different media outlets to find the killer when we found the car. So I called different media outlets, and fortunately the victim advocates had explained to me how to do that and what to say and to send pictures right away.
I remember there was a quote that you told me, and it's something I'll never forget, Dede. You told me that one of the detectives said to you, which motivated you even more to keep getting the word out there about your sister, the media loves a dead white girl. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't a detective. If I did say that, I apologize. They might have, but I heard that from someone who was a victim advocate. And she said that the media definitely favors, and this made me sick, really sick and uncomfortable when she said this.
I mean, this was 30 years ago. It may still be true.
She didn't say it to make me uncomfortable. She said it to educate me. But they're interested in how physically attractive the victim is. And physically attractive victims get a lot of attention, and white physically attractive victims get a lot of attention. And it does not go unnoticed by families of color who lose somebody. So when they say stuff, it's a fact. Now, here's the good news. You may get this attention, but sometimes you get much less attention than other cases. There are other cases that other victim advocates that I worked with, when they would lobby and stuff like that, people would run to them and jump for them. They didn't do that for me. But the one thing that I learned is it's not really good to be in that position where you have heavy, heavy media like that. You attract a lot of defense attorneys, and there's a good chance your case will not you won't win the case in court. And it's 1,000 times more traumatic. And they forget that a person was murdered. It becomes this sensational case.
Yeah, it's a circus.
The circus.
Can I just ask, I just really want to bore down on this thing about your employer, because I think these are some of the takeaways that we can share about how to help the healing begin for a survivor, a family member. But then, of course, there's the ripple effect of friends who might have employers. The friends of Rachael had employers. If you could have had your experience with your employer go differently back then in real time, what do you think that your employer could have done better to help you balance that work life with healing from this tragedy? And what do you think your employer did really well? Those are the takeaways that I'm really interested in.
Okay, so what my employer did really well is that the human resources individual was fantastic. The person who's paid to work with you, explain how the leave process works, explain basically that I would not lose my job if I were to take leave, and so forth and so on. But I would lose medical benefits after a certain period of time and things like that. But this was a really strong support. My boss, my supervisor, was uncomfortable with it, and I didn't feel very supported. And then when I finally did a story with the media, I was savvy enough to call the PR department for my bank, which was a major financial institution in Wall Street. And I called them, I told them who I was, and I said, I just want to make sure that I'm not going to tell them where I work, but if they do find out where I work, I don't want to get in trouble with the bank that I worked for at that time. And he was wonderful. He said, oh my goodness. And his job is PR, so of course he knows how to speak to someone. But he was very supportive, and he explained how the media works and how they were going to interview me for a real long time, but I was only going to see like at most 30 seconds, if I'm lucky, maybe 20 seconds. And he said, you're going to see that it's going to be very clever the way they put it together. They're going to find the most important things that they feel are most important. He said, just tell them you prefer not to say where you work. But if you do, they do. But it's not part of the story. I said, the part of the story is what you want to tell them. And he explained to me how to do it. And so I would say employers need to help victims out that way with PR so that they understand that if they do speak to the media, that the media does not have to know where you work. And you could say, I prefer you don't say where I work, but you could say that I work in Wall Street or something like that in general, not the actual company. I prefer you don't do that. But also explaining the leave process. What employers could, and they did that very well, what they could have done better, but at the time they have employee assistance programs. And I had a great insurance program too, where you could get counseling if you needed it. And they have employee assistance programs that you could call up and get help through them. And that's where they can do better. And those employee assistance programs would be hooked in with the victim services programs, which I have to say was extraordinary. To find myself with other families that were going through what I went through was really unbelievable. I don't know how I would have done it without hearing from these people and being able to share these stories. They really understand victims. And I tell you, one night I went to a meeting, I'll never forget it. And this is how well they understood it. And there was an elderly woman that worked there. And sometimes they would make us ice cream. They would make us an ice cream sundae or something like that. And I went to visit her, and she kept shooing me away from the meeting. And I didn't know what was going on. Like, why is she not letting me go to the meeting? Is there something going on with another victim that I don't know about? They don't want me to know. Was there a fight between a couple families? I mean, I didn't know what was going on. And she sat down, she gave me some ice cream and started talking to me. And after a while, I said, can I ask you a question? And she just kept talking to me about how I was feeling. And I talked to her about how my week was and all that. And I'm saying, okay, enough questions, what happened to the meeting? And she said, oh, that was last week. And I was there for about a long time, So I thought, nowhere else would somebody know how to do that.
So you came on the wrong night, you missed the meeting, and she was just there, and she
happens all the time.
Sat with you and had a calming conversation. And
yeah, and I told another a father of a son who was murdered. He said, oh yeah, that happened to me too. He goes, apparently it happens a lot. So it happens a lot. Families do, they come on the wrong night. Instead of saying, oh, I'm so sorry, you came on the wrong night, what they do instead is they sit down and talk to the victim for 20 minutes to a half hour. And then, oh, by the way, the meeting was last week. So you don't feel like you got ran over by a train because you're all confused. And you do get confused. There's a lot of trauma. It takes about 2 years of a roller coaster.
So I think we have to close the loop on this call from the killer.
Okay, so I started doing TV shows because I talked to other victims' families.
Can you name really quickly like 3 or 4 of the shows you did?
Well, I know I did something Broadway. It was on Channel 9. I did Fox News. I did Channel 11. These are all local stations, and they were really big at that time. Those were the big ones that I did in the beginning. And again, the National Victim Center helped me with the media.
But that was the way to do it back then, to get the word out so other people would know about the case and what you were looking for. Because today, obviously, we have social media. You go like, do, 140 characters, and the whole world knows what you're looking for. But back then...
I think it's actually harder now because you have to compete and get through all that social media. And you have to wait for someone to read it. But back then, you could call on the phone and actually get a real producer on the phone. And if it was a quiet day, they would cover the case. And I remember the National Victim Center, there was a woman who was a victim advocate for them. And she helped me a lot with this stuff. She explained to me how to call the media and put together a letter. And this is back in the days when you would send the same letter out. And I got a whole bunch of pictures of my sister, which I actually sent in the mail, picture of her, so they were forced to look at the picture. Those were the media stations later. So Broadway 9, this one station, it was shown in California. So it was shown in New York and it was shown in California. And I remember thinking, wow, not as many people watch Matt Lauer. Matt Lauer was the host. And this is when Matt Lauer wasn't famous. And they show this show in California and some other stations across the country. And I remember thinking, well, not that many people are going to see it, but you never know. You could get lucky, right? And when I came home that night, I had this message on my machine. And I was warned by other families, be careful because there's a lot of very crazy, lonely people out there. They'll call and say, I killed your sister. And they do that. That happens a lot to families. And they don't know anything about the case. They're completely full of it. Mm-hmm. And I had prank phone calls, all kinds of stuff. So I didn't want to take it seriously, but the guy had a foreign accent. But the things that he said to me really shook me up.
Did you answer, or was this an answering machine message?
Answering machine message. And I accidentally did something to the message. And then I remember I always call the detective. And that one time I didn't call the detective. And they tell you every time you got to call the detective. He would have jumped all over this. I don't know if they would have been able to trace this phone call, but he said some things that were very sexual. And he said sexual things about my sister. And it was very, very upsetting. If you know anything about sex crimes, or they call them sex crimes, but they have nothing to do with sex.
Correct.
They're just horrible. And he was saying, oh, she was so scared and she tasted so good and, all this stuff. And it really upset me that someone could say stuff like that. And this is really not too long my sister had been murdered. It wasn't like I had a few years under my belt. And so it was a really difficult one. And the accent was there. So it threw me off. And later on, when we went to the trial, that was when it clicked for me. And I know I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know it was him. I just know. And he was in California at the time. So he saw this thing on California. He got really excited. And he was almost like breathing on the phone. He was so excited. And then my father got a phone call too. And he said some stuff that were gang-like things to my father. But my father, unfortunately, was going through the first stages of dementia. So it didn't even faze him. He didn't really pay attention. So now that we know more about him and his personality, and the victims' families in California said they got a lot of phone calls threatening them, describing what happened to their relatives. These are really scared people. They're terrified there. They wouldn't even, the victims of my sister's murder wouldn't even register to know if the guys were paroled or not because they were too afraid. And I tried to convince them that they would be safe, but they were just so afraid. So we were shielded from this monster, really. We didn't have to deal with the threats or any of that stuff. We were very, very lucky that way.
I just want to thank you so much, Dede, for being with us and for sharing this really compassionate, very like rich and detailed experience of what it was like for you back then, specifically, having the resources that you were able to have and how you put energy behind getting answers. And
Can we interview Dede again down the road?
absolutely. I mean,
I have a million more things I want to talk to her about.
I mean, as long as you're okay with that, Dede.
I'm okay with that. And I'm sorry everything was so discombobulated.
It's okay. Next time, think how easy it'll be.
Wow. Dede is very inspiring. I think she gave some amazing information for people who are dealing with the legacy of trauma. And she created a whole ecosystem and a family and a community around her that was just full of support and information. She gravitated to that support and she clung to it, it feels like. And she let it breathe her when she couldn't breathe. You know what I mean? Like it's so beautiful. And yeah.
It's actually quite remarkable because in 1988, the world of victim services was not nearly as robust or all-inclusive as it is now. I mean, I think about how far we've come in the last 34 years in the world of victim services, and the world of trauma and brutal murder, sudden unexpected death of a loved one was not trauma-informed. These were very immature processes and organizations. And the fact that Dede not only took advantage of all the resources that were available or offered, she flushed out more and then brought those people together. She was like the glue, bringing the few resources that existed together to make things stronger by her being that glue. And a lot of what I reflected on after listening to what she had to say is how far we've come in the world of victim services and how she had to do so much work to weave that tapestry of support. And I think today we do a much better job of offering the support and wrapping around people who want the support. So we've come a long way, baby.
Yeah, that's a great reflection. Thank you so much, Dede. It was great to have you.
Thanks to audio producer, mixmaster, and sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio. Thanks also to media producer Michael Doherty. And thanks to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Schreeman. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thanks so much for listening.